Welcome, everyone. This is Chet Binning recording live on August 15th, 2025. This presentation will be an introduction to iron and hemoglobin, which can explain fatigue, weakness, shortness of breath, and many other symptoms. I want to start by showing you this chart right here. Fatigue, weakness, shortness of breath, coldness in hands or feet, rapid or irregular heartbeat, dizziness or lightheadedness. These are all examples of a lack of oxygen delivery to tissues throughout your body, otherwise known as anemia. But before we expand on this concept of anemia, of iron, of hemoglobin, I want to pause and highlight a really important concept that applies to this, but also future topics that we will discuss. Symptoms like this and many others that we can experience on a daily basis are not normal. This is what we're told, right? From the age of 40, 30, sometimes even 20s now, we are told that symptoms like this are just a normal part of aging. We have to deal with it. It's the body starting to break down. I'm going to show you why that is absolutely ridiculous. The body is so much smarter than we are, even with all of our modern technology. I was reminded of this yet again just a few weeks ago with the birth of our second child. You're telling me that we can make this beautiful thing seemingly out of nothing, which grows up to be a kid and an adult, yet from the age of just 40, 30, or even 20, we have to cope with symptoms of the body breaking down. It just doesn't make sense. And so I'm going to show you that symptoms like this, and many others, but we're going to start here today, is the body telling us something. These are very useful symptoms that if we gauge them properly, we can actually use them to identify what's lacking in our body, make the improvements required, and then feel better. And that's ultimately the goal, right? Because stuff like this is unpleasant. It's impairing with our daily life. We want to feel better, improve our health, reduce our risk for illness, and that's ultimately the goal here. So what is iron and hemoglobin? Well, most of us have heard of iron. Of course, you can get it from diet. Iron is required to make hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is a bit less well known. It's a protein that's found at the center of your red blood cells, which is responsible for carrying oxygen. So we all know that oxygen is important, pretty important stuff, right? We can't live without it. Every single organ throughout our body requires it. But how does it get there? Well, it's hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is actually hanging on to that oxygen in your red blood cells, and then your blood just transports it to wherever it needs to go. Therefore, and this is probably the most important part of this presentation, and really another example of the concept that I just explained, that the body is trying to tell us something. Therefore, insufficient iron can equal, it's not always the cause, but can equal insufficient hemoglobin, which means impairments to our biochemistry because you're not getting oxygen delivery, which means impairments to your physiology. In other words, you feel it. You feel off. Something's not working well. And there's a cause. And this is what's going on with this scenario of anemia. Now, it's not only the symptoms. This can cause real damage over time. So, for example, many studies showing there's an association between low hemoglobin and risk of mortality. So in other words, low hemoglobin is associated with an increased risk of death. Many others, and it goes both ways. This actually works as a U-shaped curve. But pardon me, this one is showing that higher hemoglobin, so within a healthy range, is associated with better physical performance. So you can see low hemoglobin, not good, increases risk of mortality. Higher hemoglobin within a healthy range improves physical performance, even in older adults. So it's pretty important, obviously, right? And then last, but certainly not least, this is a really interesting graph which highlights this U-shaped curve, which shows that low levels are detrimental, but very high levels, which you'll actually get elevated levels above normal if, for example, someone's using testosterone. If they're taking exogenous testosterone, their levels will become artificially elevated. EPO is another common example. Commonly abused in many sports, especially cycling. We can all think of the famous example. This would be another example that artificially elevates hemoglobin to a detrimental level. But the point here is you can see there's a healthy level, and then being too low or too high impairs health. So it's not just the symptoms, it's also risk of illness. Now that you understand the underlying physiology or the underlying biochemistry, even just a little bit, remember, iron is needed to make hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is needed to carry oxygen. Oxygen is obviously pretty important. We can now explain these symptoms that we feel. Now, quickly, as a side note, there's other possible causes of these, right? I'm not saying that anemia is the cause of these symptoms 100% of the time. Absolutely not. I do not want to give that impression. But remember, we're talking about anemia. And so let's use this context to explain these symptoms. Fatigue, yeah, obviously, if you're not getting enough oxygen to tissues, you're not going to be creating as much energy, because for the biochemists out there, oxygen is required to make ATP. It's required right there on the electron transport chain. You can't make ATP without oxygen. Pale skin, again, obviously you're not going to have the same delivery of oxygen and nutrients to extremities of your body, because your body will prioritize more important organs first. Shortness of breath, same idea. You get the point here. Headaches, again, same idea. You have less carrying capacity, and so it takes longer to get there. Hence the headaches or the dizziness. Your body's really trying hard to get those resources there, but it's harder. Depression, this is an interesting one too. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain that makes us feel really good. And so if we are lacking dopamine, which is very common in modern day, low dopamine will decrease our mood. It will impair our motivation, our drive. It will cause symptoms of depression. Now, what does this have to do with iron and hemoglobin and anemia? Well, in order to make dopamine, we need oxygen. So specifically the conversion of tyrosine into L-DOPA, which is needed before making dopamine, that's dependent on oxygen. So that's why anemia is also associated with depression. And so you get the point with these other ones: cold hands and feet, brittle nails, and hair loss. So these symptoms are meaningful. The body is trying to tell us something. Now, how can we actually detect this? Well, contrary to popular belief, low hemoglobin on its own is actually sufficient to cause impairments. This is contrary to the common narrative, which suggests that we also need low red blood cells, and low hematocrit. Now I'll get to this more in the next presentation where I go into a little bit more detail. But as an example, hematocrit is a very misleading marker. It can actually be modified if we are dehydrated. And so whether or not it's low is not a definitive sign because it is so easily modified by lifestyle. Another example, red blood cells. Your number of red blood cells is separate from your hemoglobin. Now I'll just give you the example here to help visualize this. So you can actually, from someone's blood work, you can determine the color of your red blood cells. So this is referred to the chromic nature. So you can have hypochromic or hyperchromic, and this refers to how red your red blood cells are. If your red blood cells are really a rich red, then that suggests that you have high hemoglobin because that protein at the center is red. It makes them appear that way. Whereas if you are hypochromic, which again, you can identify this based on your blood work, that tells us that you have low hemoglobin. Now, the point here is that you can have the same number of red blood cells, but the color of them can be different. And so you don't need low red blood cells, low total number to experience impairments. You can have a healthy number, or pardon me, a moderate number of red blood cells, but if those are lacking hemoglobin, then you're not going to be carrying oxygen as efficiently and you're going to experience these symptoms. So I know this is getting a little bit into the weeds, which is why I'm leaving most of this for the next presentation for folks who want more information. But the key here is that low hemoglobin on its own is sufficient to cause impairments. Now, specifically, these are the numbers to look for, and these are using numbers, drawing a blank on the word here, using metrics, pardon me, because different countries will use different metrics. This is based on Canadian numbers, so if you're living in the United States, you'll have to convert this. For males, 14.5 to 16. For females, 13 to 14.5. These are healthy ranges, meaning that if you are below this, this is sufficient on its own to cause impairments. Now, importantly, low ferritin may accompany this. Ferritin, just think of this as iron. Ferritin is the stored form of iron, but ferritin and iron is really only the supply because it's required to make hemoglobin. But remember, what are you actually going to feel? Are you going to feel low iron? Not necessarily. It's possibly going to be there, but it's not necessarily the cause, because remember, what is actually responsible for delivering that oxygen? It's hemoglobin. And so if you have low hemoglobin, might your supply be low? Yeah, for sure. But like I said, we want to focus on what the actual underlying cause is. What is actually delivering the oxygen? And then last but certainly not least, diet is incredibly telling. If you don't have the blood work, but you can explain your diet in pretty reasonable detail, oftentimes that's enough. Now, this is what it looks like on your blood work. Not necessary. So if you don't have this, don't worry. That being said, hematology, so white blood cells, red blood cells, etc., this is the most common, the most basic, and often the cheapest blood work. So a lot of people will have this whether you realize it or not, which is awesome. That's great, right? It means you don't have to spend hundreds of dollars on all these different lab tests to figure out why you're always tired or out of breath. So you'll see hemoglobin right near the top. Now let's look at a historical and cultural perspective. This is so interesting to do. I think this is really underutilized with nutrition and health discussions, especially on social media. So if you do a simple Google search and say who's most at risk for iron deficiency, you're going to get all the stereotypical answers, right? I like to call this the parrot narrative because it's the same thing over and over again. One person gets it or Google gets it, and then they just keep passing it on and on and on. And no one ever really asks critical questions like, is this true? Where did this come from? Is this the case for everyone? Is there other variables that affect this? So this is the problem with not only Google, but also social media, is that there's no context. And that's what I'm going to show you right here. And we can provide context with not only the science that we just went through, but also history. So what does history tell us? What increases or decreases risk of anemia? So listen to this. This is so fascinating. First of all, anemia used to be, and I'm talking about Canada again, used to be a lot less common. But what's one potential reason? Well, if you ask your grandparents, nasty foods like blood sausage, liver, you can throw bone broth in there. These used to be common. They used to eat these several times per week. This is important because these are the richest sources of iron. You can also throw red meat in there. They used to eat red meat regularly because they weren't scared of it like we are now. We can even look at the Canada Food Guide from the 1940s. You can see that they were recommending every day at least one serving of meat, fish, poultry, and also use eggs and cheese, and liver frequently, right there, liver frequently. And then at the bottom, this is very interesting as well, a fish liver oil, like cod liver oil. This is rich in vitamin A, and vitamin A is important for healthy iron levels. So these are reasons why anemia used to be a lot less common. Now, maybe you're saying, okay, that's all interesting, but I thought anemia started to become common, especially amongst children, especially in the 1940s, and that's why we started to fortify food. Aha. Around this time, modern science told women that cow's milk was superior to breastfeeding. And so a lot of women, the majority of women, followed this and started to give cow's milk in exchange for breast milk earlier. What's interesting about this and how does this affect iron? Well, cow's milk is a rich source of calcium. Calcium impairs iron absorption. It impairs iron absorption. So what's going to happen to an infant who is now receiving calcium at a younger age? Well, they're probably going to have lower iron, and then they're going to be at an increased risk of anemia. Now, maybe if you're really savvy, you're saying, but breast milk is also rich in calcium. So how is that any better? Breast milk is indeed a rich source of calcium, not as concentrated as cow's milk, but it's still quite high. But breast milk also contains a protein called lactoferrin. And do you know what lactoferrin does? It increases iron absorption. And one of the ways it does this is it negates the negative effects of calcium. Again, nature knows best. Our body is so intelligent. It's really incredible. And the more you learn about it, the more remarkable you realize it is. In fact, you will see studies now that show if you combine your iron supplementation with lactoferrin, because you can also supplement lactoferrin, it enhances absorption. But hey, nature's already doing that. Now let's look at the cultural perspective, because we can also get some interesting clues from other parts of the world. Let's look at India. India has some of the highest rates of anemia in the world. at over 60%. This is their national rate, over 60%. And many places are a lot higher than this. But if you look at a single state, it is under 40%. This one single place. So that begs the question, what are they doing different here? Well, in this state, they are known to eat more meat, including red meat, which is the best source of highly absorbable heme iron, which is needed to make hemoglobin. Let's look at another example. Southern Asia, the average rate of anemia is 35%. In the Philippines, they have much lower rates of 15%. Why is that? Well, they have a coastal diet that's rich in seafood and other meats, including red meats. And so, not surprisingly, what can we do if we suspect anemia or low iron? We need to focus on absorbable heme iron, which comes from meats, especially red meat. And we can't rely on non-heme iron from plant sources. Now, that doesn't mean vegetables are bad. It doesn't mean we shouldn't consume plants with non-heme iron. It doesn't even mean that non-heme iron is useless. So I disagree with folks who really just attack non-heme iron or plants in general for that matter. There's value in really most foods that have come from the earth. What am I talking about in this scenario? Well, plant foods that contain non-heme iron, that iron is very poorly absorbed because of something called phytate. So phytate is an anti-nutrient naturally found in plants, which binds up that iron. So in other words, it makes it harder for the body to absorb. So what use might this have in humans? Well, iron is basically like crack for pathogens. So if we have some type of infection, whether it's bacterial or viral, it will fuel and feed off of iron. And so the body does have mechanisms in place to actually hide iron from these pathogens. But if we are sick, what are we going to eat? Should we be consuming copious amounts of iron and eating tons and tons of iron rich foods? Probably not, actually. And so in these instances, maybe some non-heme iron is actually advantageous to provide some nutrients while also preventing that iron, which is going to actually fuel that pathogen and that infection. So really interesting stuff. Again, the body and nature is just so brilliant. So just a couple more quick points here. How can we actually improve iron intake? Well, no surprise here. We want to focus on heme iron sources, and that is red meat. So there's some seafood that's very concentrated as well. And the highest source, or at least right at the top, is liver. Now, if we pair this with iron, that is, if we pair this with vitamin C, that will increase the absorption. We also want to avoid consuming these foods at the same meal with excess calcium. So think about dairy. Absolutely nothing wrong with dairy, but if we are consuming in abundance, could that impair our absorption of iron? Yeah, possibly. If we are supplementing, ferrous bisglycinate is the best form. This has been shown in randomized controlled trials. It also has the fewest GI side effects. And then other factors, which we're going to get more into in the next discussion, is things like cofactors. So by cofactors, I mean other micronutrients, because it's not just iron here. There are many other important ones, such as, well, I mentioned vitamin C, I mentioned calcium, but also glycine, B6, other B vitamins. And there's actually ways to look at your blood work and determine what B vitamins you might be lacking. Vitamin A is another important one, copper, zinc as well. So there's many other factors and variables to discuss. And now we can actually have some context for this Google search that said Maybe you asked it who's most at risk of anemia, and it says things like women, especially those who are pregnant, or it says children, or it says vegan or vegetarians. Now we have some context. And you can apply what you've learned here to think a little bit more critically about these, whether you see it on Google or you see it on social media. So are women more, or pardon me, are women at a higher risk? Yep, for sure, because they lose blood every month, so they have to replace that. Especially pregnant, yep, for sure, because now their tissue that requires oxygen is much greater. They're carrying a child that requires more, and so they need to be consuming more. Infants and children, uh, we have to look at the evidence, right? We have to look at history. We have to look at other cultures, and those are variables that are going to affect what risk they are at. Vegans or vegetarians, now you know why. And then some other more nuanced examples like digestive issues or um, endurance athletes, for example. But these are things that we will get into in the next discussion. And I've already mentioned these. Some other things we'll get into, so I'm not going to get into those right now. If you have any further questions, right now the best place to reach me is on Instagram at Brain Ignition. Please feel free to send me any questions, comments, or do so on this video as well. Thank you.